Hi there, and welcome to another edition of the Israel-Palestine Report. Today we're going to be talking about the moves that Netanyahu made today to solidify what is becoming an authoritarian rule for him in Israel. We'll go back to talking about Gaza probably tomorrow, and we'll talk a little bit about Gaza in this episode too because it's related. But since this is flying under the radar because everyone's talking about Gaza, I think it's definitely worth talking about. Israel took the biggest steps that it's ever taken, I think in 24 hours at least, towards being an authoritarian state. Of course, Israeli democracy has always been very flawed, especially in the West Bank, where, there is no democracy. But Israel itself has always been rated by political scientists and so on and so forth as a flawed but functioning democracy. And I think today it's taken some steps away from that that may end up having some historical ramifications. So what happened? After months of foreplay, the Netanyahu government finally got around to firing the Attorney General, Gali Bahrav Miara. That's a big deal because she's the only safeguard within the government that tries to stop executive overreach. If she's gone, the only thing that's left is the court system. And the government voted unanimously to remove her after talking about it for a long time. The support in the government was serious. But immediately, the Supreme Court President Noam Solberg, who, by the way, is the most conservative justice in the Israeli Supreme Court, said, quote, no changes in the Attorney General's powers or work arrangements are allowed during this period. No interim replacement can be appointed, nor can the Attorney General be boycotted. So until this issue is resolved by the courts, she will remain in place. It's expected that they will order the government to keep her in place in the long term, but it's not clear that the government will listen to that. They've threatened to ignore Supreme Court orders before, much like Trump has. They kind of learn from each other. Gali Bahram Miara herself said, quote, from now on, the government can fire any attorney general, the country's chief prosecutor, without oversight and even without proper reason. So the there have been several reasons that the government wants to get rid of uh, of Gali Bahram Miara. She's blocked many of the moves that the government has tried to do. For example, she has ordered the investigations of several ministers that the government has tried to block for obvious reasons. She's stopped the undermining of um, government norms. She's tried to protect the trials of Netanyahu. She tried to prevent the most extreme measures of the judicial reform that wanted to undermine the ability of the courts to have a check on the executive power of the government. She's been a very consistent voice as well on the other issue that we're going to talk about here, which is the exemption from the draft for Haredi yeshiva boys. And that leads us to the other thing that happened today. The Knesset committee voted to remove Yuli Edelstein as the chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and instead appointed Netanyahu loyalist and Likud MK Boaz Bismuth. Now, the reason they did that is because Edelstein has been insisting on a law, and he's the one who's responsible for drafting this kind of law as the head of that committee, on a law that does not give a blanket exemption to all Haredi men from the government. That has led to the Haredi parties leaving the government after months of a wrangle over the issue. Edelstein said, quote, all along I asked for a fair and genuine draft law for representatives of the ultra-Orthodox public do not want conscription. And he said that the fact that he has been fired is, quote, the final nail in the coffin for the draft law. Now, the fact that Edelstein has been removed doesn't really solve the problem for Netanyahu because the problem wasn't just Edelstein. Edelstein was the person standing at the forefront and who took serious political risks in order to prevent a law that would allow draft exemptions from going through. But a lot of people in the Likud and in other parties in the coalition don't want to give the Haredi men an exemption. And the reason is because it's incredibly unpopular in the general public, and it also undermines the morale and the ability of the army to fight at a time when the army is spread very thin. Um, there have been a lot of people killed in Gaza, injured in Gaza, with PTSD in Gaza, uh, people who have been in the reserves for many, many months and are suffering as a result, and the army is overstrained. So the fact that all these men are given an exemption is incredibly unpopular at this time. It's seen as unfair and it's seen as an undue burden on on the IDF, and the opposition leaders are using it to attack the government, of course. Benny Gantz said the dismissal of Edelstein for political reasons is a disgrace. We won't abandon our soldiers. The coalition must do what's right for Israel and not trade our security for political survival. Um, so the removal of Edelstein is also an attempt to steamroll over the Israeli public and get something very unpopular passed in order to preserve the coalition. The sidelining of independent legal oversight threatens the democratic checks and balances at the heart of Israeli democracy. And it also undermines Israeli security, and it emboldens the social divides at a time of war when most people in the country don't support the operation in Gaza anymore. They want a ceasefire. They want the hostages to come back. And in the meantime, the chief of staff has also come out against the operation in Gaza that is supposed to escalate in private cabinet discussions. And Netanyahu has threatened that if he's not on board with the operation to take over all of Gaza, that the government will discuss tomorrow and most likely vote for that he should hand in his resignation. And all this leads us to the same place. There's increasing opposition to what Netanyahu's doing in the Israeli public and in Israeli society. Not because Israeli society believes strongly, most Israelis don't believe that it's a genocide in Gaza, that there are serious war crimes being committed there, but rather because the war seems to be going nowhere from the perspective of Israeli public opinion, and the hostages are at risk, and the government is undermining the democratic norms, and there's no equality in who's shouldering the burden of military operations at a time when the IDF is sacrificing a lot in all of these conflicts. So all of this is leading to an increasingly authoritarian bent by Netanyahu. It really feels like if this operation is approved tomorrow to expand the war and take over Gaza, and we'll talk about that tomorrow if it's approved, he'll be doing it with very little support in the public at a time when his coalition is in a minority government, and he's going to have to try to shore up support over the next 2 months before the Knesset reconvenes and his government can be dissolved. So over the next few weeks, we'll be watching very closely as Israel tries to take over Gaza, tries to finish this genocide with very little domestic support, and while becoming an increasingly authoritarian society domestically. There's just a lot of pressure on the Netanyahu government and on Israel as it also faces increasing diplomatic isolation from the outside. So I'll be making these every day, I think, over the next few weeks. trying to keep up with all the increasingly dramatic developments that I believe we'll be seeing. So stay here. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Consider subscribing to my Substack, The Grand Scheme, and I'm going to be revitalizing my history podcast with some exciting announcements about that very soon. So stay tuned to that. I'll see you here again next time something exciting happens, almost definitely tomorrow.